30 seconds till the burn. The deorbit burn is underway. The propulsion officer reports 2 good orbital maneuvering system engines. Atlantis starts the beginning of the end of a journey that started with the aerodynamic testing of a craft called Enterprise in 1977, punctuated by the maiden launch of Columbia in 1981, culminating this morning with a night flight to the Kennedy Space Center.
Atlantis, good burn, no trim required.
Good burn, no trim required. All those engines worked beautifully up until the very end.
Outstanding.
Commander Chris Ferguson aboard Atlantis, complimenting those orbital maneuvering system engines that have functioned time and time again in support of space shuttle missions for so many functions. Atlantis now committed to a landing at the Kennedy Space Center. Touchdown scheduled 1 hour, 3 minutes, 53 seconds from now.
To your post-burn reconfig.
Copy, Butch. We'll put it in work.
With Atlantis now heading home to the Kennedy Space Center, preparations are underway for the grading of the 4 crew members on the orbiter by officials and, most importantly for the moment, the convoy team out on the shuttle landing facility. Standing by to provide an update for us on pre-landing preparations down at the landing site in Florida is George Diller of the Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs Office. Let's go to George now.
This is Kennedy Space Center shuttle ground operations, and all is in readiness for return of Atlantis. Atlantis will cross the Florida coastline near Naples, continue inland to the west shore of Lake Okeechobee, then northwestward toward Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center. The approach and landing is planned for runway 15, a northwest to southeast approach. Once the rollout of Atlantis is complete, the point on the runway where the nose wheel stops will be marked, and later a permanent marker will be placed at the edge of the runway, designating the final stopping point of Atlantis' last landing and the final landing of the Space Shuttle program.
Copy, go for the maneuver. Here we go.
Most of the final landing preparations at the shuttle landing facility runway were completed yesterday when all of the convoy vehicles and their support systems were turned on and checked out. There was a thorough sweep of the runway to check for possible debris, and that sweep was repeated again this morning. The runway operations are being controlled by Landing and Recovery Director Greg Gaddis in Firing Room 4 of the Launch Control Center, and by the Convoy Commander Tim O'Brien at the Shuttle Landing Facility runway. The Landing and Recovery Director's consoles were staffed for landing starting at 2 a.m. this morning. The landing team, who will meet Atlantis on the runway in the vehicle convoy after touchdown, had their last and final briefing for the landing this morning just a short time ago at 4:15 a.m. The convoy then began moving out to the shuttle landing facility at about 4:45. There are a total of approximately 50 vehicles that make up the convoy. Not all of those vehicles are on the runway at one time, but enter at various pre-designated times during the 4 hours of the post-landing activities. Also earlier this morning, the microwave scanning beam landing system, the precision instrument landing system used for the final approach, as well as the visual landing systems were turned on and received a final checkout. Now that the deorbit burn is complete, they are pre-positioning their convoy vehicles near the end of the runway. We have confirmation that all of the navigation aids are on and ready to support the landing. The weather here at the runway is reported to be excellent. Winds are not a factor at all. They are just 2 knots out of the west-northwest, and the temperature on the runway is 73 degrees. Lighting at the shuttle landing facility, in addition to the traditional runway edge lights and the approach light system, there are 16 xenon lights that produce 1 billion candle power, each having an effective range of 6.2 miles. There are 2 groups of 4 lights located at each end of the runway, with the lights currently illuminating runway 15, shining down the landing field toward the southeast. The Mila tracking station on Merritt Island at Kennedy will acquire Atlantis about 13 minutes before landing at 5:43. Atlantis will be at a distance of approximately 500 miles from touchdown, and Mila will begin supplying controllers in Houston with voice, data, and telemetry communications. Meanwhile, at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, radar contact with Atlantis will also be made at that time. The orbiter will make the approach to Kennedy Space Center using the ground-based tacking system or tactical air navigation system, which is the radio homing beacon at the shuttle landing facility. The orbiter will require that signal at about 11 minutes before touchdown, and also being used aboard Atlantis for the landing is the GPS Global Positioning System navigation system of satellites. The long-range optical visual trackers at Kennedy and at Patrick Air Force Base south of Cocoa Beach will acquire the orbiter visually about 8.5 minutes prior to touchdown. As Atlantis approaches KSC and intercepts the heading alignment circle, the The orbiter will begin following the curved approach of the microwave scanning beam landing system at the shuttle landing facility. This will be providing the orbiter with range, elevation, and azimuth information, which is fed into the orbiter's navigation system. The twin sonic booms will be heard at KSC about 3.5 minutes before landing, and shortly after that, the pilot's point of view camera will then provide video of the runway from the cockpit. Atlantis' weight as it touches down on the runway will be 226,375 pounds, which is 39,715 pounds lighter than when it launched, reflecting what was left at the International Space Station. After the orbiter's landing rollout is complete, there will then be the usual safety inspections and the so-called sniff check to look for any toxic propellants which may have leaked or be venting. The astronauts will configure switches in the cockpit for the post-landing activities and be participating with KSC ground operations teams to safe the vehicle in preparations for the astronauts to disembark. The landing team is customarily given a briefing on any problems that may need special caution or attention once the orbiter is on the runway before they approach it. And once it's free of any toxic gases, the purge and coolant umbilical access vehicle will move into position around the rear of the orbiter, and those connections will be made. Then at that point, the crew transport vehicle will be moved into position adjacent to the orbiter access hatch on Atlantis' port side. That usually occurs about a half an hour after landing. Some of Atlantis' surface will be very, very hot after landing from reentry, so the hands-on inspections cannot begin until the orbiter has completely cooled down, about 45 minutes after landing. This includes a cursory inspection of the landing gear and the orbiter's wheels and tires, and there will be a quick look status of the orbiter's thermal protection system tiles. Also, a physician will board Atlantis as soon after landing as the crew access hatch can be safely opened. He'll conduct a brief preliminary examination of the astronauts before the crew leaves the orbiter. Then the astronauts can make the preparations to disembark and enter the crew transport vehicle, which usually occurs between 45 minutes and an hour after landing. Then at that point, there will be more thorough physical examination of the astronauts, which takes place on the crew transport vehicle. That lasts about a half an hour, and then the astronauts will have the opportunity for a walk-around of the orbiter on the runway. Afterwards, before leaving the runway, they'll make some brief remarks, also joined by our NASA Administrator, Charlie Bolden. The crew will then board the Astrovan for the 5-mile trip back to the astronaut quarters. Atlantis' tow to the hangar will begin approximately 4 hours after landing, or about 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and it will be going into Bay 2 of the orbiter processing facility. Then Atlantis will be fully destowed for the final time, and deservicing will then begin. Atlantis will eventually go on public display at the Kennedy Space Center at the visitor complex.
You can expect a positive HDL on your first.
Once back at the astronaut quarters, all of the crew will undergo more thorough physical examinations, then have something to eat and see their immediate family members. They're planning to go back home to Houston on Friday afternoon. Once Atlantis lands after 200 orbits, it will have spent 307 days in space and traveled nearly 126 million miles during its 33 flights since its first launch in 1985. At 54 minutes, 22 seconds from the landing of Space Shuttle Atlantis, this is Kennedy Space Center Shuttle Ground Operations.
This is Mission Control Houston. Atlantis is currently flying just to the south of the continent of Australia, about to pass across the South Pacific en route to the Kennedy Space Center. As you heard from George Diller down at the landing site at the Florida Spaceport, we're about 53 minutes away from touchdown. Atlantis is going to be dumping propellant out of its forward jets. The aft reaction control system steering jets will be controlling the shuttle's aerodynamic functions because there is not enough air pressure in the upper regime of the atmosphere for the Elevon's rudder, speed brake, and body flap to become active until the shuttle descends further into the atmosphere. We're 21 minutes away from entering the point called Entry Interface over the Pacific Ocean, at which Atlantis will be 400,000 feet in altitude, traveling 25 times the speed of sound, with a range to touchdown of 5,000 statute miles from the Kennedy Space Center. "16 minutes after we reach the atmosphere and the astronauts begin to experience the first pull of gravity against their bodies in 13 days, Atlantis will be commanded into a series of roll reversals designed to bleed off excess velocity and inertia that it has built up during its time in orbit. Also will be commanded through a series of S-curves, S-shaped curves, also to dissipate energy as it approaches the landing site. The ground track will carry Atlantis over Central America, just to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula, out over the Gulf of Mexico. It will fly west of Cuba. Its computers honed in now on runway 15, the northwest to southeast approach to the 3-mile-long landing strip at the Cape. The entry team of flight controllers, led by Entry Flight Director Tony Sacacci, went through a fairly pedantic timeline today in the deorbit preparations. There were no weather issues whatsoever, very little discussion with the Spaceflight Meteorology Group. The conditions down at the Kennedy Space Center are perfect, with clear skies, 10 miles of visibility, and as you heard, just about 2 knots of crosswind. At the time of its landing, Atlantis will have accrued 125,935,769 miles over its 33-flight career, spanning 26 years, and will have navigated 4,848 orbits of the Earth. Its maiden flight in October 1985, STS-51J, was a classified Defense Department mission commanded by Carol Bobko, landing now just 49.5 minutes from now at the Kennedy Space Center to conclude 3 decades of space shuttle operations. Atlantis now dumping the propellant remaining in its forward jets, only the aft jets to be used for controllability of the vehicle during entry. Atlantis now has dumped all of its forward propellant. Everything is looking very good. All of Atlantis' systems functioning perfectly. Auxiliary power unit number 3 was activated prior to the deorbit burn to support that activity. The other 2 APUs will be turned on momentarily in support of landing. Now 15 minutes away from entering the first discernible traces of the Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean.
Houston, here comes APUs 1 and 2 on time.
We're ready and watching. Thanks, Chunky.
Pilot Doug Hurley about to activate the remaining auxiliary power units.
And Houston, if you're ready, here comes SSME hide repress.
We're ready for that, Chunky. Also, hide fluid thermal conditioning is not required.
Copy. Thermal conditioning not required.
Pilot Doug Hurley receiving the news that no hydraulic conditioning of the space shuttle's main engines will be required for their repositioning once Atlantis reaches the landing site at the Kennedy Space Center. All 3 auxiliary power units up and running in good shape. Everything is quiet here in the Space Shuttle Flight Control Room. Nearby, in front of the main administrative building here at the Johnson Space Center, Building 1, a giant jumbotron is showing the view that we are seeing of Atlantis' homecoming in what will amount to a celebration of sorts, even though this is a night of mixed emotions, of course, with the Space Shuttle program winding down to its final 43 minutes before touchdown. But there are hundreds of people outside the Johnson Space Center, all wanting to be part of a moment in history. Here in the Space Shuttle Flight Control Room, the team of entry flight controllers led by Flight Director Tony Sacacci now on their entry cue cards to match The procedure is being followed by Atlantis' astronauts up on the flight deck. Rex Walheim, the flight engineer, seated right behind Commander Chris Ferguson and pilot Doug Hurley, and between them, to his right, Sandy Magnus. Just 10 minutes away from feeling the first tug of Earth's gravity in almost 2 weeks, Atlantis will be entering the Earth's atmosphere at an altitude of 400,000 feet. Temperatures around the orbiter will build to about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The guidance officer here in Mission Control reports that we're about to transition the general purpose computers to Ops 304. That's the entry load of software that governs the orbiter's characteristics as it enters the Earth's atmosphere and begins the process of informing the computers as to the role reversals that will be conducted and the curves, the S-band curves that will be taken by the shuttle to bleed off excess velocity and energy as it approaches the landing site. We're just 6.5 minutes away from entry interface. Everything is going very well. We're told, by the way, that the line stretching to come into the Johnson Space Center for folks wishing to participate in the moment of history is stretched out all the way from the main mall here at the Johnson Space Center all the way out to NASA Road 1, the main thoroughfare in which you drive into this Space Center, indicative of the level of interest for this final shuttle landing that is just 38 minutes away. Atlantis about to enter the Earth's atmosphere, traveling 25 times the speed of sound right now, 83 miles in altitude, range to touchdown 5,300 statute miles, all of its systems functioning perfectly. Atlantis now at the point of entry interface, now entering the Earth's atmosphere. The force of gravity will be building up against the 4 crew members up on the flight deck. Atlantis 74 miles in altitude, range to touchdown 5,000 statute miles. Descending at a rate of 500 feet per second. All of its systems in excellent shape. The flight dynamics officer reports that the latest balloon data is all in sync with everything that had been prescribed for Atlantis' deorbit burn. We're still targeting runway 15, the northwest to southeast approach to the 3-mile-long landing strip. This is Mission Control Houston, less than 30 minutes to go before Atlantis' touchdown. The viewing room here in the Space Shuttle Flight Control Room is nearly filled at this hour with a variety of former flight directors, their families, invited guests of the Center Director, Mike Coates. And again, outside of Building 1 here at the Johnson Space Center, crowds continuing to build here in the final minutes prior to Atlantis' touchdown, watching the proceedings on a big Jumbotron screen right outside of the main administrative building here. Atlantis 55 miles in altitude, range to touchdown to the Kennedy Space Center is 4,000 statute miles. Descending at a rate of 430 feet per second. Time to touchdown 28 minutes. In about 12 minutes, Atlantis will be commanded through the series of roll reversals. There are 3 that are pre-programmed to dissipate excess velocity as Atlantis approaches the landing site. This front screen view here in the Space Shuttle Flight Control Room showing the ground track of Atlantis that will pass over Central America, just to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula, back out over the Gulf of Mexico, west of Cuba, with landfall over the Florida Peninsula, over the southwest coast near Naples, Florida. Atlantis has now begun what is called closed-loop guidance, banking its wings about 70 degrees to the left and then back to the right, the initiation of the dissipation of excess energy. Soon to cross over Central America, time to touch down 26 minutes. Down at the Kennedy Space Center, this view of runway 15, the northwest to southeast approach that Atlantis will be touching down on just 25 minutes from now. All preparations are in order at the landing site with the convoy teams in place, ready to attend to Atlantis and its crew of 4 following wheel stop. As Atlantis approaches the coast of Central America, currently 46 miles in altitude, range to touchdown 3,000 miles. Again, a view of the crowds outside Building 1 here at the Johnson Space Center, who are making the most of this memorable occasion, participating in a moment in history and the completion of the Space Shuttle program. Flight controllers here in the Space Shuttle Flight Control Room in the final minutes of shuttle operations for this room that first saw activity on the STS-70 mission in July of 1995. Atlantis approaching the coast of Central America, traveling 22 times the speed of sound, its nose pointed 40 degrees up in its angle of attack. Range to touchdown 2,300 statute miles, time to touchdown 21.5 minutes. "20 minutes until touchdown. Atlantis now less than 2,000 miles from its landing site, 43 miles in altitude, dissipating energy and inertia built up through its activities in orbit. Its wings pointed almost directly to the Earth through a series of banking maneuvers. Maneuvering also through a series of pre-programmed S-shaped curves, first to the left, then to the right, reducing its speed as it approaches the Florida coastline. First, it will traverse over Central America, then to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula. Roll reversals are coming up for the shuttle.
We are doing fantastic. How about you?
We're doing fantastic, but I wish we could share with everybody this really cool glow. It's just amazing outside.
Yeah, we were just talking about imagining it ourselves.
That was easy for you to say.
Enjoying the ride home, Commander Chris Ferguson describing what amounts to the plasma buildup around Atlantis as it descends through the atmosphere about to cross the coast of Central America. Capcom Barry Wilmore is the voice you're hearing here in Mission Control, talking directly to Atlantis' astronauts 18 minutes from touchdown. Atlantis now 41 miles in altitude, range to touchdown 1,400 statute miles. The report from the space station flight control room is that NASA flight engineer Mike Fossum was in the cupola at the time that Atlantis descended through the atmosphere and was able to see Atlantis's plasma trail through the cupola windows of the International Space Station. Less than 15 minutes before touchdown, Atlantis moving just to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula, about a minute and a half away from acquiring communications to the Merritt Island tracking station near the Kennedy Space Center. The International Space Station will be passing directly over the Cape just 9 minutes before Atlantis' touchdown and should be visible in a clear sky this morning. Atlantis about to pass across the Gulf of Mexico, traveling 14 times the speed of sound, now 700 miles from the Kennedy Space Center, 34 miles in altitude, descending at a rate of 126 feet per second. C-band radar tracking now acquired through the Merritt Island tracking station near the Kennedy Space Center. Atlantis just 450 miles from its destination, 31 miles in altitude, traveling 10 times the speed of sound, nearing the southwest coast of Florida.
Atlantis, we show you on energy and on ground track. Your nav is go. We show you touching down 2,200 feet at 205 knots, and you should see 19% on the speed brake.
Okay, we copy all. Approach at 19% on the speed brake.
The flight dynamics officer here in Mission Control reports Atlantis is perfectly targeted for the Kennedy Space Center. Time to touchdown 11 minutes. Everything looking very good on board the orbiter.
Atlantis, take TACANs, take GPS.
The TACANs are the Tactical Air Navigation Aids. 3 redundant units aboard the orbiter receiving data of range, elevation, and bearing from radio beacons at the landing site. Atlantis about to cross the coast near Naples, Florida, 10 minutes to touchdown. 260 miles from the landing site at the Kennedy Space Center.
Beautiful view of the Yucatan, I think, going right under the wing right now. It's a gorgeous day, or evening.
You're looking good to us, Atlantis. You're just passing the west coast of Florida.
Oh, okay. Further than I thought we were. Yeah, a little bit of an echo.
This track will carry Atlantis just to the west of Lake Okeechobee, 24 miles in altitude, 200 miles to the Kennedy Space Center. Now traveling less than 6 times the speed of sound. Descending at a rate of 200 feet per second. Time to touchdown 9 minutes, 14 seconds. The air data probes have been deployed. These are probes on either side of Atlantis' nose that provide pressure, altitude, airspeed, Mach numbers, angle of attack, and rate of descent information for the general purpose computers. Time to touchdown 8 minutes. Atlantis traveling 4 times the speed of sound.
Atlantis, take air data.
Take air data.
6.5 minutes from touchdown. The International Space Station just passed directly over the Kennedy Space Center in advance of Atlantis' landing. Atlantis currently traveling 2.5 times the speed of sound, range to touchdown just 69 miles.
Atlantis on energy approaching the hack. No changes to winds or weather. Nominal shoot.
No change to winds and weather, nominal shoot.
Now looking over the shoulder of pilot Doug Hurley on the flight deck of Atlantis, this pilot point of view camera. 5 minutes till touchdown. Atlantis soon will be going subsonic. Our first view through infrared cameras at the Kennedy Space Center. Commander Chris Ferguson now flying Atlantis. 3.5 minutes until touchdown. Piercing the pre-dawn sky as the space shuttle announces its arrival at the launch site with its signature sound of twin sonic booms having gone subsonic for the last time.
Atlantis, on at the 180.
Copy, on at the 180.
Pilot Doug Hurley now taking a few seconds of stick time on Atlantis. With a fitting elegance for its final moments of flight, Atlantis takes one last lap around the Kennedy Space Center.
Atlantis, on at the 90.
On at the 90.
Commander Chris Ferguson now back on the stick. Atlantis descending at an angle 7 times steeper than that of a commercial jetliner.
Hey, field beside Houston.
Copy, Atlantis. Field in sight.
As it approaches the runway, Commander Chris Ferguson will flare up Atlantis' nose to burn off excess speed prior to the landing gear deployment by pilot Doug Hurley. Once again, the view from the pilot point of view camera, 1 minute till touchdown. The pre-flare maneuver executed. Landing gear down and locked. Main gear touchdown. Hurley now deploying the drag chute. Ferguson rotating the nose gear down to the deck. Nose gear touchdown. Having fired the imagination of a generation, a ship like no other, its place in history secured, the space shuttle pulls into port for the last time, its voyage at an end.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle's earned its place in history and it's come to a final stop.
We copy your will stop, and we'll take this opportunity to congratulate you, Atlantis, as well as the thousands of passionate individuals across this great spacefaring nation who truly empowered this incredible spacecraft, which for 3 decades has inspired millions around the globe. Job well done, America.
Hey, thanks, Butch. Great words. Great words. You know, the space shuttle's changed the way we view the world, and it's changed the way we view our universe. There's a lot of emotion today, but one thing's indisputable. America's not going to stop exploring. Thank you, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Endeavour, and our ship Atlantis. Thank you for protecting us and bringing this program to such a fitting end. God bless all of you. God bless the United States of America.
Inspiring comments, Atlantis. We'll meet you on 5-3.